It's the Jump Around on the ESPN Madison YouTube channel. Jesse Nelson, Pablo Iglesias in for Jim Rutledge this week and talking more about the Xavier Lucas transfer portal situation. He's going to Miami by skipping the portal entirely, and it could set a new precedent in college football and college sports. We are joined now by Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports college football writer. Shehan, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us today to shed your insights on this situation. First of all, how are you on this beautiful Thursday?
I'm doing great. Thankfully, I'm down in Texas, but we missed some of the snow. So I don't know how exactly we got this all backwards, but we're doing great. Thank you.
I was going to ask you where you were joining us from, because based on like Florida and Texas are getting snow. We just got a dusting yesterday here in Madison, but it wasn't even that bad for the first few months of winter. So it's been crazy. And speaking of crazy, let's talk about the college football landscape and the transfer portal. What is going on with Xavier Lucas heading down to Miami? Because this is... we're on the cusp potentially of starting a brand new chapter of college sports, it feels like, based on what the ruling is that comes from this situation.
No, I mean, this is the big thing, right? Is the big question is going to be, how far does everyone want to take this? Because it could just be a warning shot, right, from Wisconsin to say, we don't like the way that this was handled. We want this to be addressed. This could turn into a huge lawsuit where potentially at issue would be whether the idea of a player being able to leave a rev share agreement would be on the table. Because what Wisconsin is essentially claiming is that these revenue sharing agreements, which technically cannot be finalized until after the House v. NCAA case is finalized in April, that these will be binding. And not only would that be a huge precedent to set for Xavier Lucas in Wisconsin, it would be a huge precedent to set for the future of college football if they could essentially make the case to the courts that these revenue sharing contracts need to be executed and are essentially binding. That's completely up in the air right now. Nobody at this point has challenged it, because this is the first time that we've ever really seen these revenue sharing agreements, since they're only set to take effect in 2025. Now, what the courts could do if it does go to trial is they could say, look, in this individual case of Xavier Lucas, where you have a contract and a memorandum of understanding essentially that can only be enforced after the House v. NCAA deadline, that before it, because we are still not at that point as yet, maybe they just say, well, in this case, it doesn't apply. It can't be binding at this point. But certainly, again, it comes down to how far everybody wants to push this.
Shehan, I know this is unprecedented right now. This is, as you said too, and we were even talking about this is the first time that a school has ever, an institution has ever come out, and heck, even the Big Ten Conference backing up Wisconsin. Let's talk about Wisconsin first. Do you think that a move like this hurts the brand, or do you think this is a good move for Wisconsin to jump out and say, hey, we are not going to take this?
No, I don't think it necessarily hurts the brand. Again, somebody has to be first, and you're going to deal with both the positive and the blowback of that situation. But I don't think that recruits will look around and say, look, we're not going to pick Wisconsin because, whatever, they're not supporting their kids. Now, I do think that there is value. Like, I think if somebody like Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State, who's been very forward of, if you want to leave, we're going to support you. We're going to be very visibly and vocally supportive of you. I think there are benefits to that. But I don't think it necessarily hurts Wisconsin to say, we feel like we have contracts in place. We feel like we've promised you something and we want to back it up. Because the reality is most players who are transferring into the program aren't necessarily thinking of what's going to happen when they try to get out.
The Big Ten specifically calling out the ACC in their official statement. That was what was fascinating to me, because especially when you see like the evolution of the college sports landscape, who's to say Miami in a couple of years isn't going to want to join the Big Ten if it comes to it, with the ACC kind of being in the state that it's in? Shehan, what stood out to you from that statement specifically? Because each component of each layer of this is so fascinating to me.
No, you're absolutely right. And there's such a power struggle going on right now between essentially the SEC and the Big Ten and everybody else. And, I used the word warning shots earlier, but really every single part of this is warning shots. You mentioned, of course, Miami, if they're looking for a new destination, if they ever want to leave the ACC. You mentioned, of course, with just the Big Ten versus ACC dynamics. And these dynamics impact things, obviously, in the context of the college football playoff, in terms of the revenue model, even in terms of, the Big Ten having very powerful television partners as well, and that really have some ability to impact the way that the sport is impacted. So again, a big part of this is just how far do people want to take this? Because the Big Ten is kind of coming out and saying, and they did it very quickly, I may point out too. They weren't shy about going out and putting out a statement immediately. But, how far do people want to take this? Do people want to take this to, if Wisconsin, for example, sues Xavier Lucas and sues Miami or something of the like, does the Big Ten get in on this? Does the SEC get in on this? Do any of the television networks get in on this? This can turn from a small deal into a big deal really, really quickly.
Yeah, with the way that things are kind of going with the conference and how it's changing and all that too. But the transfer portal, with the process that Xavier Lucas has gone on to go to Miami, take himself out of classes at Wisconsin, Shehan, I'm curious, do you think that, not saying that this is the end of the transfer portal, but do you think there are going to be some changes, some new rules, some regulations? What's your thought on the way that Lucas ended up going to Miami?
Well, it's a unique one for sure. I don't necessarily know that it's going to have huge long-term effects because, again, when you look so far at the rest of college football, even these programs and situations where maybe they have signed rev share agreements, it's very rare that a player is denied the right to be put into the transfer portal. And all the transfer portal does from a logistical standpoint is exactly that. It deals with logistics, right? It deals with, hey, your name is out there, your contact information is out there. It's a public indicator that this is happening. Because there are downsides and risks to unenrolling from a school, because then again, you have to deal with some of the logistics of moving over documents, moving over transcripts, things of that nature as well. So I don't necessarily know that there's going to be some giant precedent that's set by this, because again, I think the bigger picture precedent is Wisconsin just refusing to put them in. That's something that I think is going to be fascinating. And look, I think that, Darren Heitner, who of course is Xavier Lucas's attorney at this point, he said essentially in that memorandum of understanding for the rev share agreement, it was incumbent on him, one, being in school and enrolled at a certain point, and two, the approval of the House v. NCAA document. So they basically attacked both of those things in order to try to get out of this agreement, both unenrolled from the school and also did it before the House agreement went into effect. I don't know that this is going to be a precedent that necessarily is involved the same way heading forward.
I know it's such a difficult thing to try and predict what the outcome will look like. CBS Sports college football writer Shehan Jeyarajah joining us here on the Jump Around. I think what ultimately is going to happen here is he's going to play at Miami, but he may not be able to make NIL money until the terms of that agreement are done. What do you think of that prediction of this, or do you have a different way that you see this scenario ultimately playing out when it's all said and done?
Well, some of it has to do with the verbiage, right? We don't necessarily have all of that information right now. But I do think ultimately that a court will look at this situation and, one, point out the fact that the House v. NCAA case was not confirmed at this point, which I think that they can make a pretty compelling case that means that it wasn't legally enforceable at this point. The other thing, too, is that look, when you look at NIL contracts, which are going to be different than rev share contracts, absolutely, but NIL contracts were really not dependent as well on pay for play, essentially, on the idea of a guy being enrolled at an individual school. That will be different with revenue share, but the question is the enforcement aspect of it. So from my perspective, I think the courts are going to try to punt on it, not necessarily make the giant sweeping decision at this point. And I think they'll say, hey, you know what, he got out of that contract before the contract was necessarily eligible to happen. Because the other piece of this, too, is that at this point, nobody else has tried to essentially get out of a rev share agreement. Because, again, Xavier Lucas at this point is the only one who's publicly kind of been announced as doing that. And heading forward, when we get to the post-spring transfer period, that'll happen only after House v. NCAA is officially settled and decided. So I could see the courts ultimately punting on it and saying, look, hey, Wisconsin, you make some good points. Hey, Xavier Lucas's camp, you make some good points. But right now, we're just going to say that this is not enforceable right now, and we're going to punt a long-term issue until down the road.
Shehan, I'm curious too. I know we've been saying rev share a lot, rev share. So for the folks at home too, I wanted to get some explanation on that and what this means for players moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, when we look back at the NIL era, dating back to 2021, schools kind of weren't formally allowed to have contracts with players. What they would do is they had these third parties called collectives, and players would sign endorsement contracts with these collectives that would essentially function as a pay per play, but it wouldn't necessarily be part of the organization. If you're a politics buff, think of it as a super PAC. That's essentially what a collective is. Now, what they're doing instead, after this settlement, which is like this giant settlement that deals with the last couple of years of name, image, and likeness of college football, and really all college athletes as well, is that they're saying it is legal now to pay per play, to revenue share money with athletes. Now, they're doing it in such a way where they won't formally be considered employees as well, which comes with a whole nother level of complications. But it means that schools can complete direct pay-per-play contracts with athletes on campus. So, for example, you might hear, a very famous case going on right now is that of Darian Mensah, the Tulane quarterback who transferred to Duke, and he signed reportedly a $4 million contract. Well, that's coming out of an assigned revenue share, most likely. Now, it might be supplemented with outside collective and NIL money, but it's primarily coming from a direct pay-per-play. So the argument that Wisconsin is making essentially is that we are directly coming into an agreement with this individual player to play football at our school. And if he chooses to leave voluntarily, he's breaking the terms of that contract and essentially causing us distress.
And all this being said, Ohio State won the national championship 3 nights ago. That's the state of the sport right now. It feels like it's wacky, it's wild, but that's what makes it so fun. Shehan Jeyarajah, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insight on this situation. It is so fascinating to see how this is going to continue to develop. And, us as Wisconsin Badgers fans here are going to be interested to see what happens long term and how this impacts the sport as a whole.